On April 14, 1917, President Wilson issued Executive Order 2594, which created the Committee on Public Information, better known as the Creel Committee. Simply put, it was the government's propaganda department. Creel's job was to sell the war to the American public, to discourage unpatriotic talks and the censorship of any war information, as well as the press. Now, to that end, Creel set up an agency that controlled every bit of war information the American public heard or saw. If there was any information the government felt was detrimental to the war effort, it was buried or kept secret. Now, the committee used newspapers, posters, telegraphs, and movies to broadcast its message, and its message was to sell the war to America. Now, Creel was born December 1st, 1876 in Blackburn, Missouri. He was one of 3 sons. In 1896, he began his first formal job at the Kansas City World. The job paid $4 a week. Now, starting as a reporter, he worked his way up to feature writer, book reviewer, and social writer. It was this last assignment that got Creel into trouble with his editors. Showing signs of a conscience, Creel did not feel it was appropriate to discuss the elopement of a very wealthy Kansas City businessman's daughter to a coachman in the society pages of the newspaper. The editor of the papers decided George should seek employment elsewhere. Creel made his way to New York, where he would work as a freelance joke writer for William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer's newspapers. By 1899, he was back in Kansas City to start a newspaper called The Independent. Now, he dealt with the social issues of the day, such as women's suffrage, single tax system, and public ownership of the utilities. He became a strong supporter of the Democratic Party at that time. Now, George was moving up in the world. Now, he decided to leave Kansas City and become an editorial writer for the Denver Post. It was at the Post that George might have taken freedom of the press a little bit too far. He gained national attention when he called for the lynching of 11 senators who opposed the public ownership of Denver's water company. Now, as appealing as that might be to some people, George was in hot water, and discretion being the better part of valor, hastily resigned his position. He then moved to the Rocky Mountain News, and with the presidential election approaching, Creel jumped on the Woodrow Wilson bandwagon. Now, it was during President Wilson's re-election campaign of 1916 that Creel became deeply involved in the Wilson campaign. He would write feature articles and conduct interviews of politically important people of the day. Right after war was declared, April 6, 1917, Wilson signed the Executive Order 2594, and on April 13, 1917, established the Committee on Public Information, CPI for short. Wilson appointed Creel to head the committee. Creel immediately got to work setting up the committee. The board was composed of George Creel, Secretary of War Newton D. Baker, Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniel, and Secretary of State Robert Lansing. These 4 men would control how America thought about the war. Secretary Baker stated it was the fight for the minds of men, for the conquest of their convictions, and the battle lines ran through every home in every country. Now, Creel was a little bit more succinct, and he stated it was about how we advertised the war. The committee quickly began to classify the American people by race, age, occupation, education, so that the appeals might be adapted to reach every section of the population. Every possible form of publicity was studied and applied by the high-pressure methods which, though new at that time, have since become commonplace in the popularization of ideas or products. The CPI controlled every type of media in the country, from newspapers to patriotic posters. There were the 4 Minutemen in the movie theaters, victory posters in factories, Pamphleteers. The CPI used any and all types of media to sell the war. The committee was the central agency which collected information from government agencies, including the War and Navy departments, concerning what the government was doing to win the war, and then prepared it in a suitable form for distribution throughout every known medium of publicity. To suppress any opposition to the war, Wilson had Congress pass the Espionage and Sedition Act. Now, these acts outlawed any negative criticism of the government, and this led to 1,000 convictions. It made it punishable by law to make slanderous statements about the armed forces, hinder the sale of war bonds and enlistment, and for opposing the causes of the United States. Without any serious opposition from the press, the CPI had an unhindered voice to shape America's public opinion on the war. The official bulletin, that's the government's daily newspaper, swamped the American media landscape with paper. Its main purpose was to control all important news items concerning government activities. Newspapers consumed the official bulletin because it gave them more news than they could possibly print in any given day. Now, with the government controlling access to the news, Creel and the CPI were able to manipulate public opinion in support of America's war against the Central Powers. Manipulating the newspapers and magazines were only part of the CPI's job. If you went to the theater, you were treated to a patriotic speech made by the 4 Minutemen. They were given that name because that was the time it took to change the reels in the projection booth. These 4 Minutemen had to sell the war in as patriotic terms as possible during that time period. William McCormick Blair was the head of the 4 Minuteman division. Now, originally, he organized men to give speeches just in Chicago prior to the entry of the U.S. into the war. Now, the CPI absorbed Blair's model, and Creel appointed Blair to head the national program. Now, every state had chairmen who would appoint a city or community chairman. These local chairmen would then appoint a number of speakers to cover the theaters in the city or community for which they were responsible for. Now, these speakers were highly trained. Creel went so far as to say they were as effective in the battle at home as was the onward rush of Pershing's heroes at St. Michel. The approximate number of speeches given was about 750,000, and the total audience reach was around 314 million. They didn't just speak to theater goers. They went to the factories, the grangers, lumber camps, anywhere there was a crowd to deliver their 4-minute patriotic message. These speeches covered topics such as universal service by selective draft, the First Liberty Loan, Red Cross organizations, food conservation, why we are fighting, what our enemy really is, unmasking German propaganda. These men were able to convey their message quickly and to the point. Their numbers were numerous, and they covered every city and town in America. Now, during the war, you could not go anywhere in the country without seeing some sort of war poster. There were posters for food conservation, posters for war production, and most importantly, posters for financing the war, the buying war bonds. They were called Liberty Loan drives. Two of the most iconic posters to come out of World War I and are still in circulation today as wall art were done by James Montgomery Flagg and Howard Chandler Christie. Flagg's iconic recruiting poster of Uncle Sam pointing at the viewer and saying, "I want you for the U.S. Army," was brilliant. Now, Howard Christie used the appeal of a woman with the Christie Girl. His recruiting posters are just as iconic and brilliant as Flagg's. It's the famous poster, "Gee, if I were a man, I'd join the Navy." Now, all of these posters had one common denominator. They played on the American public's emotion. Another aspect of selling the war to America was the use of films. Now, the CPI would use still and motion pictures from the Signal Corps and create patriotic films to inspire the home front to give more, and more. An example of the CPI film division was Pershing's Crusade. It was a 4-reel production. The opening shot is of a medieval knight on horseback flanked by 2 American doughboys. The film was officially presented in 24 cities. Now, this would be the first time motion picture would be used to show the American public what was happening in the war zone. Now, the CPI had over 20 bureaus and divisions dispensing pro-American ideas, values, and patriotism. Its work was very effective, but it did have a tendency to go overboard. Thomas Fleming stated in The Illusion of Victory, quote, "Not all reporters believed the official bulletin was trustworthy. On July 4th, 1917, this skepticism caught Creel in the first of many untruths," close quote. The CPI told the story of the 1st Division's voyage across the Atlantic, during which their escorting warships fought off the repeated attacks by German submarines, and several of the undersea pirates had been sunk. Yeah. After the division arrived in France, reporters interviewed men from the 1st Division. The men said the incident never happened. You would think that Creel and the committee would have learned a lesson, but now the committee was caught making up stories over and over again. Now, Creel's committee took another hit for stating that the first American battle planes were on their way to Europe in February 1918. The story was a complete fabrication. Only one battle plane had been produced, and it was still in the U.S. Now, these are just two examples of the many accounts of disinformation or misinformation released by the CPI during its 2-year run. The effectiveness of the CPI can be summed up from a quote by Walter Lippmann. He's the famous reporter, writer, and was a political advisor to President Wilson. Quote, "The general tone of it was one of unmitigated brag, accompanied by unmitigated gullibility, giving shell-shocked Europe to understand that a rich bumpkin has come to town with his pockets bulging and no desire except to please." The CPI did manage to sell the war to America, sometimes a bit heavy-handed. Now, whether you agree with the CPI's tactics or not, it was the dawn of modern advertising. Well, I hope you found this video interesting. If you did, hit that thumbs up button, ring the bell, and subscribe to my channel. This way you'll be notified when I post new videos. If you could just take the time and leave a comment below, that would really help. The YouTube algorithm sees the comments. The more comments I get, the higher the algorithm will rank my video, which translates to a wider audience. Thank you for watching.